Hello and welcome to Speak Shame with me, Dr. Connie Corrali. I'm grateful that you're here. Before this episode begins, please accept my apologies for the quality of the sound. On today's episode of Speak Shame, I just felt this overwhelming shame, like I'd done something wrong, it was my fault, and overall I felt like the best solution was just to keep quiet about it. Every time I told my story, the power that shame had over me, that was enough to silence me for so many years, has just gone. Before we start this episode, please be aware that we'll be discussing sexual violence, which could upset or trigger some people. I've provided links for support in the show notes. Hello, remarkable woman. I'm your host, Dr. Connie Corrali, medical doctor, life coach, and survivor of sexual violence. And you're listening to Speak Shame, a collection of inspiring conversations with remarkable women who have faced and overcome adversity. By sharing their stories, my hope is that you may find strength, connection, and hope in your own journey, and that shame itself loses its power. So sit back, relax, and don't forget to follow the show. Over the next few weeks, you'll get to listen to remarkable women sharing their stories of facing and overcoming adversity. So I want to take this opportunity in the first full-length episode to share my story with you as well. So we're going to do things slightly differently. Joining me today is my very good friend of over 20 years, who I've also had the pleasure of being coached by, DARLEEN Davies. And she is going to be the host of Speak Shame today, interviewing me. So thank you so much, DARLEEN. And I'm going to hand over the reins to you.
Oh, wow. Thank you. The pressure. This is like my first podcast I'm interviewing for.
Hey,
Right. Yeah, you sent me this message only last week to go, can you interview me about my story? And I was like, absolutely, yeah, because your story needs to be shared. I know you've got a real powerful story that needs to be shared, and it's got you where you are today. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to share to the world where you are now and the purpose of your work. So thank you. Yeah, thank you. So, and let's just, if you were just to tell me again, and reminder for the audience is like you and I have known each other now for 20 years plus. Actually, we met at university. You were in the middle of medical school when I first met you. Always that laughing, giggling, positive energy. And really that's never, ever changed for me. You were there for me when my dad died. So yeah. You mean a lot to me, and the importance of your journey. If you can tell me a bit more about why at this point in 2024, your story is out to the public now about what's happened to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, DARLEEN. In that intro, you just showed how our connection is really strong and our roots are really deep, and we've been there for each other through thick and thin. And I think that is also kind of a key part as well to my story, because, you know, it's a story of shame, and it's also a story of how vulnerability and connection really is the antidote to that. And so I kind of actually want to go back a little bit to 2015 when it all kind of started. I remember actually because a few years earlier you had got married. A lot of our friends had gotten married a few years before that, and I was in mid-30s, dating back in 2015, in and out of the online dating world. And I think at the time, I kind of was thinking, oh my gosh, like, what is wrong with me? Like, why can I not get past that third date? Like, that was the kind of life I was going through. But living a happy life as a GP, great friends, great family. And then my life kind of got turned upside down. A guy that I had been dating, it was the second date we'd been on. And yeah, I remember waking up the next morning and realizing that I'd been raped. And I had no memory of quite a few hours from the night before up until the early hours of the morning. I kind of just sort of woke up all of a sudden in his home. And I remember it took me a while actually to kind of figure out what had happened. Even though I use the word rape now, I think potentially even at the time I was kind of a bit like, what the hell's just happened? I knew obviously something wasn't right. And I recall almost kind of when he spoke to me that morning and he acted like everything was normal, I just acted like everything was normal as well. Like, I think I was already kind of going into this sort of survival mode without realizing it, of just act like everything's normal. And when I left and I got home that morning, I was thinking to myself, how long does Rohypnol last in the body? As a medic, I kind of knew that that's probably what had happened. And also kind of thinking, I think probably it's not going to be in my blood anymore, which means it's going to be my word against his. Do I want to have to go to court and be cross-examined? And do I want the devastation of my family finding out what happened to me? And I blamed myself. I thought, why did I go to his place? All these kind of judgments that I was thinking towards myself, I'd never say to anyone else, but I was really just, there was no kind of logical get help or go and speak to a friend or anything like that. I just felt this overwhelming shame, like I'd done something wrong, it was my fault. And overall, I felt like the best solution was just to keep quiet about it. Like I thought there was no benefit of me kind of going through any kind of judicial system and putting myself through that, basically. And so, yeah, I kind of just acted like nothing happened and I completely buried it. And yeah, that was the case really for three years. I just didn't say anything to anyone about it.
Wow. And if you were just to take me back to that day, if you don't mind, he acted normal the day after.
I think that's partly also why I felt that sort of shame. I felt kind of a bit like, why did I go back to his place? Like I was blaming myself, basically. Like, even, and again, I would say that for other women who've gone through this, that's not the first thing I would be thinking. I'd be like, that should never have happened to you. You should speak to someone about it, get help, you're worthy of justice, that sort of thing. It's not your fault, it's their fault. And it just did not cross my mind at all.
And what did cross your mind instead?
I honestly think that it just felt easier to bury it. And I think it's only been since having therapy, which was much later on, and I know we'll probably get into that, but it was only when I started to kind of realize why that seemed like the best option for me at the time, that I kind of understand now why I made the decisions that I made at the time. And so I think that I was so kind of hard on myself for making that decision as well when I did eventually sort of talk to the police. But I'm at peace with it. I kind of understand it now. I understand myself and why I did that, and I think I have much more compassion for myself as well, which I didn't have at the time.
Yeah, and this is the part of the work that you're doing now, is to help on this shame, which is you felt back in 2015. I hear that you've been carrying it for 3 years until you spoke up about it. Yeah. I still remember the time when you told me. It was just hard to believe because I didn't even know as a friend. So I felt like, how did I not know?
Mhm.
Well, like, I'm supposed to be one of her best friends, and I didn't even know. I had no clue. It was like normal. You
Yeah.
wouldn't have known
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. And you know what? I think you've raised a really good point there, because when very recently I kind of told my dad and I told my sort of female relatives in my extended family,
Yeah.
and I remember actually I put together this little PowerPoint presentation, of course. Yeah, I know.
PowerPoint presentation.
It's just this is how I do things. And I put this thing together, and I put in there 2 photos of me, and one was a few days before I was raped, and one was a few days after. And honestly, even me looking back at those photos, I couldn't tell the difference.
No,
So I'm not even surprised, really, that my brother was staying with me in my flat at the time, and he talked about how he didn't notice, and I know that, because I was able to bury it so deeply and just carry on. And that's one of the things I talk about now, is that we just don't know what's going on in other people's lives, because it's so easy to put on a facade and to present to the world, you know, a face, an appearance that you want them to see, when inside you could be falling apart.
Yeah.
And quite genuinely, though, those first 3 years after it happened, I think I just buried myself in work. I remember I was working as a GP. I was doing a master's part-time. I was socializing. I carried on dating other people. I just carried on like nothing had ever happened. And really, the only reason I spoke up 3 years later, so this is 2018 now, the Me Too movement had happened, and that kind of started to kind of bring the memories back. And I genuinely mean bring the memories back, because that's how deep I had buried this. Like, when Me Too, yeah, it was, honestly, I was just like, oh my God, that happened to me. Like, that's how deep that memory was. I was just like, okay, yeah, that happened to me. And in 2018, there was a really key turning point for me on my journey, and it was related to Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who at the time, she's an American psychologist, and she testified to the US Senate Judiciary Committee about being sexually assaulted as a teenager by one of the Supreme Court Justice nominees at the time. He's now a Supreme Court Justice, but at the time he was just a nominee. And she went forward and said, I don't actually want to be here. I'm paraphrasing here. She said, I don't want to be here. I'm terrified, but it's my civic duty to tell you what happened to me. And just hearing those words, it struck me that, yeah, like I don't want to have to talk about this, but actually if I could prevent this from happening to someone else, that was enough for me to be like, I'm going to speak to the police about it. And literally a couple of days after hearing her say that, I went to the police and I told them what happened to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. And you said, I want to prevent this from happening. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think even at that particular point in time, it wasn't about getting justice for me. Like, I still didn't feel like I was worthy of justice. That thought was not entertained at any point over those 3 years. But it was this whole kind of realization that by letting the police know, even if I thought nothing was going to be done about it, mainly because obviously it had been 3 years, what evidence is there going to be? But I thought, I know his name, I know his number still, I can tell the police and they can put it on their files. And so if anything ever happens to anyone else, they've got this, information on him already. And actually, it came as a surprise to me that the investigation actually went on for a good few months by the police. And I think I probably had heard lots of stories about what happens when you report rape to the police before, and I think that you read about things in the newspaper or listen on the news, and you think to yourself, oh gosh, it's going to be an awful experience. And I think that actually I was only met with kindness by the officers who investigated my case, whilst after a few months there wasn't any evidence and wasn't enough evidence to carry it on. I was still proud of myself for going through it, but I completely also understand as well that that's not the experience for everyone that goes through a police investigation. And I also have to kind of recall that whilst it was a turning point sort of that led me to reporting it to the police, that's actually when things really started to fall apart for me in my day-to-day life. We talked about just earlier how I kind of confided in you about what happened. That wasn't immediate. Even after I told the police, that still took a few months before I could do that, because I really wasn't able to be vulnerable with people still. I really felt empowered for about the first 5 minutes of letting the police know what happened to me, and then I was just like, all these emotions that had been buried for 3 years just came to the surface, and I had no idea what to do with them.
Yeah. And taking you back, you said this was like your worst time for you. What made you say, oh, this is the time to start telling my good friends, including my, what was,
It was a real kind of trickle effect, actually, because I think when everything had been buried for those 3 years and I wasn't thinking about it, I was able to function as normal. I got on with my job as normal. I was doing a master's. Everything happened as normal, and it was all fine. I think what I started to realize was that work. So I was, working as a GP 3 days a week, and I remember really kind of just finding it so much more draining than I had previously. I mean, and being a general practitioner, it is busy and it can be very draining, but this was more so than normal. Yeah. And you take on a lot of the struggles of other people, not necessarily intentionally, but you're listening to other people's lives on a daily basis. Every 10 minutes, it's something different. And I think because I was feeling emotionally drained in my personal life, that meant that the capacity that I had then to deal with everything else was much less. And so I started to think, actually, maybe I need to leave general practice. I need to leave this job that I'd loved doing. And I first of all decided to speak to a friend of mine. Actually, it was a guy who was training to be a psychologist who I'd dated previously, but we'd remained friends after it didn't work. And it was, in a way, actually, it was easier to tell him first, even though I hadn't known him for as long. Wow. Because I think there is something about telling someone who's a bit further removed from you when it's something like this, because, and this is, I think, is all kind of linked in with the shame. It was almost like, he doesn't know me as well. I just need to tell someone. And I knew he was a nice person, and he was going to be very understanding. And he was the one who encouraged me actually to seek therapy, to find a therapist, and was very kind of empathetic, understanding, and non-judgmental, and listened, and everything that you kind of need in that sort of situation. And it was the first time I just cried and let it all out. And there is a weight that gets lifted when you're able to do that. And so I went down the road of finding a therapist, and I was in a very fortunate position to be able to pay for therapy. Even though as medics, you actually have access to free therapy. But again, the shame made me think, oh no, I don't want other medics to know, even though I would never know these people. But there was that kind of feeling of, again, I'm judging myself, and what are they going to say about me? Like that's all that sort of stuff kind of goes to your mind. I wanted it to be completely far removed from the medical world, even though I know realistically they would have been confidential and it would have been just as good as any other therapy. But yeah, no, I decided to go privately, and the first therapist I found, and I actually have to say, even as a doctor, it's actually really hard to find a therapist. Like, I didn't know what I was looking for, and I refer people to therapy all the time, and I was just like, what type of therapy do I need? And so I found someone who I thought, okay, she sounds really good, and unfortunately, there wasn't the rapport there. And I remember, again, this is now the second person I'm telling. I mean, well, let's say third, because I told the police. Oh. So the third person that I'm telling about what happened to me, and I pour my heart out during this hour-long session, and it just felt like there wasn't any empathy. And I'm not sort of saying she needed to be a friend or anything, but that I wanted kind of the style of connection that I sometimes have with my patients, that kind of empathy when someone's going through a really hard time. Like, you show them that you understand that it's difficult or whatever, but it wasn't there, unfortunately. And that's fine. That may have been her style, but it didn't fit with me. Okay. But unfortunately, what that meant was I just came out of it thinking, gosh, is that what all therapy is like?
Right.
Look, they don't want to have to, I'm not going to pay for any more of these sessions. I'm not going to go back to therapy. This isn't for me. That didn't help at all. I actually feel worse after that. And so I kind of then, I think I decided to get some Brené Brown books on shame and stuff. Yeah. I mean, they are great books, by the way. And Brené Brown is like one of my kind of like idols. And even in the books, though, it just talks about part of shame resilience is connecting with others. You have to connect with others as part of it. And I just was still struggling with that. And fortunately, there was the friend that I told, we were still in communication. And it was a few months later that he sort of said to me, maybe try and find another therapist, sort of thing, because I think he could still see I was struggling. And I think at the point I'd handed in my notice to work as well, because I'd just gotten to a point where I was just like, I'm really struggling to help other people when I feel like I'm kind of, I need help. I feel drained. So I just thought, let me just step away from this job. And I kind of was like, okay, no, I'll give it another try. I'm going to give it one more try. And fortunately, I spoke to the therapist on the phone before we had our first session. And immediately I knew that there was a connection there.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of my big lessons. And I'd say to anyone who's thinking about having any type of therapy or coaching, call beforehand and just make sure you connect, because you're not necessarily going to connect with everyone, and that's okay. But I think that kind of rapport is so important. And I know I've taken so long to answer this question, but basically once I started having therapy with this lady, I was able to kind of release so much, and we were able to talk about why I struggle to tell my loved ones, my close friends like yourself, my family. And also she sort of said, you also don't need to tell people. That's not like, it's not something you have to do, but really, we kind of really explored all these areas. And it got to the point where little by little I felt like, no, actually I am gonna tell my friends. And I remember sort of telling you as well, and just that kind of, it honestly feels like weight comes off your shoulders. The tears that are shed and the kind of the hugs and that just release of this big secret that's kind of been carried around, and that whole kind of pretending to be okay when deep down you're not. And I think actually it brought us closer as friends, because it just kind of made me realize that I think I just thought in my head I had to be this sort of perfect person all the time, and that you can only have certain emotions. I needed to be this sort of happy, bubbly person, and I didn't want to feel like I needed other people as well.
Okay.
And so even though I would always feel like I'd want other people to come to me, I just didn't know how to do it the other way around. I didn't know how to go to other people and say, I need help, I'm not okay. And so, yeah, it was a big turning point, I think, again, being vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I would say that it definitely made our connection stronger.
Definitely. And I remember you telling us, and then soon after we also found another close friend who'd also got raped.
Yeah.
It was a real shock.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, with anything, fertility or building on fertility or being single, all of these are attached to shame.
Yeah.
And the moment we start speaking up, you realise a lot of people have gone through it, been through it, have felt it, and there's this deep connection, and there is that relief, isn't there? That's like, I am not alone, even though it feels like you're alone,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And there was a turning point, I know, as well, for telling your family.
Yes.
Remember you said you watched something on TV and it was like this is a moment that I need to start telling my dad.
Yeah.
And your dad was like the one that was important to you.
Yeah.
Didn't know how. So could you tell us a little bit more about that and what got you to start opening up to your dad, who is someone that you really look up to, someone that you love?
Yeah. And I mean, I think there are probably, I can count on my hand a couple of times in life where I can genuinely say that this is probably one of the hardest things I've done. And I think telling my dad that I'd been raped was definitely up there as one of the hardest things that I've ever done. And I guess there's two parts to this, because I told my dad literally just a few months ago in the summer of 2024. But I guess the first part of that is when I probably told my mum, and I told my mum and my sister, and that was a few years earlier. And at that time I was having therapy still. I had therapy for about 3 years altogether. And I remember it was a family holiday. I think we were together for Christmas. And I remember thinking, right, I'm gonna tell my mum and my sister today. This is the day I'm gonna tell them. And in my mind, it was just building up, and physically I could feel the tension that I felt. Like they're just going on their day like this is just any other day, but in my head I'm like, oh my god, I'm dying. Like I feel it was dread, it was stress, it was like chest tightness. I think I was on the verge of crying the whole day, and it was just so hard to get the words out of my mouth. Eventually I think that I think it was my mum or maybe my sister was just like, oh, is something wrong? Like I must have clearly just looked really stressed and upset. And so they asked me if something was wrong, and I just burst into tears. And I think I just remember going to my room and I was just crying, and my mum came and sat down next to me and was just like, what's going on? And then I just it all came out. And again, it was such a relief to let her know. And later on that day, I told my sister, and I just felt so much better for doing that. I mean,
and what was the impact? Like, what was the impact of you telling your mum and your sister?
Yeah, that's
how many years was it since the rape?
It would have been, I think, probably 4 or 5 years since the rape. So it was a good few years. But it just goes to sort of show as well how you can just carry these emotions with you, and they're just stored. Stored in my body, but they were waiting to come out.
Yeah.
And I think, again, so similar to when I sort of shared that with you, I think it made the bond with my mum and my sister closer, and I think we just became much more open about everything. And I was just so relieved that they knew, and I kind of said to them, I don't want to share it necessarily with my brother and my dad. Yeah, and I don't think actually I had
Connection there.
any intention of telling them. Not because I was just like, I just want to keep them in the dark. I think part of the concern I had with regards to telling my family was just this whole, I really don't want to upset them. This is really going to upset them. I don't want them to be upset. And obviously it's upsetting.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've realised is that you can't control other people's emotions. They have to manage those themselves.
So you
yeah, that was...
So to get it clear, it's like you didn't say it to your dad and your brother because you were afraid that they were going to get upset.
Yes. Yeah, and I think
that on yourself. Like,
yeah.
You're going to get upset.
I just
won't tell them. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I think probably there's also this, it was just easier to tell female relatives, for me anyway. And so after I told my mum and my sister, that I felt for me was like, this is kind of the end of this sort of journey with regards to telling my family. And so now fast forward to this summer. Yeah, so in the news, there'd been a news story about Strictly Come Dancing and how some of the contestants had come forward about some of the abuse.
Cara McDermott?
Yeah, yes, it come to light about what had happened to them. And I know this is very different, but the reason I was mentioning it is because I'd been reading some of the comments on her page, social media pages, and some of the people were like, well, it can't be true. They looked happy at the time. There's photos of them smiling. That was the sort of tone of some of the comments. And then it just made me think about, well, yeah, like nobody could have noticed that what was going on in my life. I completely looked the same the day after I'd been raped. Like nothing had changed that would have told anyone anything was going on. And I think that's so common for a lot of people, whether it's survivors of sexual violence, domestic violence or whatever. People can put on an appearance of everything being okay, but it made me want to share my story with my sort of extended family, in particular my female relatives. I wanted to kind of share with them what happened to me, because God forbid anything ever happens to them. I want them to know that they can come to me, or they can speak to a friend, or they can speak to their relative or whoever, but not to kind of suffer in silence, basically. But that's kind of what I wanted to do. And at the time, our family were doing like Zooms about well-being and that sort of thing. So I thought, let me do a talk to family members about what happened to me. But prior to doing that, because it was the female relatives, I was just like, well, I'm going to need to tell my dad before I do this, because I really was like, I really want to help. I want to share that story with my female relatives, but I don't want it to then obviously come back to my dad via someone else that this is what happened. So I was like, okay, I need to tell my dad first. And I'm in a much better place. I'd had 3 years of therapy. I'm in this loving, supportive relationship. My mum and my sister know, and they know that I'm going to tell my dad and also tell my brother as well. And that we live in different countries. And I remember kind of arranging some sort of video call with them. And I had my partner sort of sat next to me, kind of holding my hand, because again, I could not get the words out of my mouth. It really was it for anyone that's kind of had to tell someone that they love something awful has happened to them. I'm sure they can probably recognize this sort of feeling of the words being stuck and just not being able to kind of come out with it. And it took me a good while. And I think obviously he could tell that I was upset. Something was upsetting me. And eventually I was able to say I was raped. And it was a really kind of upsetting, moving conversation between us. And I think that I was able to sort of tell him one of the reasons why I didn't want to say anything to you was because of me being concerned about how you would take it and how, upset it would make you, and basically worrying about his emotions. And it was just, I felt really kind of supported in that moment, because he kind of very much sort of said, don't worry about me, basically. I'll sort of take care of myself. And I think that was probably just out of all of the kind of conversations I'd had telling people about it, and these conversations were getting easier. I tell my story now and there's less emotion attached to it because the shame has gone, basically, because with every time I told my story, the power that shame had over me, that was enough to silence me for so many years, has just gone. And even with that being said, obviously it was still hard to open up to my dad, because obviously because of the love that's there, and not wanting to see someone you love being hurt, essentially. And so I think that when I talk about vulnerability, it is with your loved ones, it is with the people that you trust, that provides that kind of healing, I guess. I think a lot of healing came from those moments, telling my family, telling other friends. And then the other thing I found was that vulnerability begets vulnerability. Often you would hear these stories that other people have experienced things because they feel open enough to kind of share their stories with you as well. And it, like you said earlier, yeah, you realise you're not alone, even though you felt like it's just you. Yeah.
So it's like it took you about 9 years of like really, really worrying about what your father and his feelings. And if you were just to bottom line, like what you perceived your dad was like prior to telling him, like what he would be like, to the moment you did tell him, what was he like after, or what did you learn from your dad?
Yeah.
What would that be?
Yeah. Do you know, I think that I was worried that he was going to be upset, and he was upset. But I can't. Yes, exactly. So upset that something had happened to me and that someone had done something to me. But I think that what I learned is that you can't control you. I think there was this kind of wanting to be able to control the emotions of other people, and you can't do that. And it's only that person that can help themselves and support. We can be there to support one another. But the outcome of telling him is that I think, again, we have a much stronger connection now as father and daughter. And I think I now know I can be really open with him about anything, and there's no kind of feeling of, oh, I'm going to be, I never thought he was going to judge me, but that I'm not worried about anything now. I feel like I can go to him for anything, and it kind of gave me this sort of freedom after I told him.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I noticed as a friend.
Yes.
Like, the moment you told your dad, you were genuinely lighter. You were genuinely a lot more free in what you're doing now with the podcast, with the work as a hypnotherapist, as a coach. There's a real freedom now, and you're using your voice. And it was like the moment you told your dad, something had released, and that was like the key to unlocking the work that you're doing today.
Yeah. I think you're completely spot on, because I think I'd been doing coaching and hypnotherapy just for a couple of years, and I realised that actually that what I was doing, the focus that I had, wasn't something that I was particularly necessarily passionate about, but I enjoy doing hypnotherapy, I enjoy doing coaching, and so I was just like, I'm going to carry on with this. But being open about my experience, and then being able to then share it with my extended family, and now sort of share it with other women, other men around the world even, I feel like going through what I went through, this has kind of become my purpose now, is to sort of say, don't let shame silence you. And actually, if we all kind of share our stories, that's going to hopefully help other people realise they're not alone, and kind of give other people hope in their own journey as well. And I think that's kind of what drives me now. And particularly with this podcast, I think that it's this wonderful opportunity to share the lives of other people who have faced adversity for whatever reason, who've potentially felt shame and come out the other side. And it is possible to come out the other side of it, and just realizing how important connections are to help with that.
Thank you. And that shame, it sounds like you did a lot of work with therapy. What, and I know you did hypnotherapy, we obviously together.
Yeah.
How did all of those facets help you overcome shame? And if there was any advice that you were to give anyone listening now, I managed this shame, like I'm holding it, I feel it. Mentioned speaking up, but the worry about other people and what they think. Yeah, is any sort of advice and any advice that you would give others? And what have you gone through? To the things?
Yeah, and I think it all comes down to, is there someone that you trust that you can open up to? When I sort of talk about connecting with others and sharing a story, I don't necessarily mean posting on Instagram or whatever so that the world can see. It really is those one-to-one connections that make all the difference. And so having someone that you trust, or a trusted professional that you can kind of release as you tell your story, I think that was really the turning point for me. And every time, I can't emphasize this enough, every time I spoke to someone about what happened, I felt lighter. And I kind of want to just caveat that with, I know I mentioned earlier that there was one of the first therapists that I saw, the rapport wasn't then. And I think that's a really important point, because whether it's a therapist, whether it's a family member that you tell, whether it's a friend, if you don't necessarily get the response that you feel like you needed, maybe you felt like you were judged, maybe you felt like you weren't listened to properly, maybe you felt like there wasn't empathy, whatever that reason is, don't give up. See if you can either find a support service or speak to your doctor or someone that will listen to you, because going through this alone is a really heavy weight to bear. And I thought that I could sort of self-help my way out of it, read some books, and then just somehow magically all that sort of trauma and all the shame would go. But obviously that wasn't the case. And the therapy that I had, the coaching that I had, the hypnotherapy that I had, they all played really different roles, because therapy was great for helping me to kind of release the trauma and really understand why I found it so difficult to be vulnerable, and then help me to start opening up to people. Whereas coaching and hypnotherapy were then, when I was at a point where I was just like, okay, well, where do I go in the future? Like, what am I going to do now? Because at the time, I think as well, when we had our coaching, I was really like, do I go back to general practice? What do I do? What's my future? Like, I then had this. Wow, it was locked down. Oh my gosh, yeah.
Your whole studio flat in
Luxembourg. Yeah. And this is it. It was that played such a role, a huge role in kind of opening my eyes to what I was capable of doing, what my purpose was. And I don't think I'd ever really given it that much thought. I felt kind of quite lost before, because therapy took me up to a certain place, but then it was like, okay, but where do I go from here? I want there to be more. And I think that's what coaching did, and what hypnotherapy did. And I think there's so many avenues people can take to help themselves.
And if there was if you wanted to let your listeners know, if they are feeling the way you did back in 2015, and they're listening to this or watching this, and they're like, I don't know what to do next. And I'm sensing now you're saying to have the courage to pick up the phone or speak with someone. Is there anything else? And how about those that can't afford therapy? You were really able to get it privately, and then even if you didn't get it privately, you had, because you worked for the NHS, you get therapy. Is that right?
Yeah.
Those that can't afford it, is there anything that you would advise those people? What would you say to those?
Yeah, I think speaking mainly about the UK, and I can't, like, the people around the world, then there are other services, I'm sure, but I think we're fortunate in the UK to have the National Health Service and have access to general practitioners, family doctors, and so that's one avenue. I think there are some amazing charities out there that help with people who've survived sexual violence. There are sexual assault referral centres, and so even when people don't have necessarily a friend or a family that they feel they can talk to, there are professionals who are there as well, who will listen and who will support you. And even if it's not necessarily the right place for you, they might be able to tell you where you can get further support. And so I think that, the key thing really would be you're not alone, and please reach out to someone.
And I really resonate with what you said there, because only 2 weeks ago I'd approached a GP about like a mole on my breast, and it like really playing with my mind, and your mind goes on overdrive. And the moment I made that phone call to the GP, I immediately felt more empowered. That I was like, okay, I'm now taking control of my body. I'm taking direction. So I think the whole point of just trying a chemistry call with a coach, speaking with a therapist, just seeking support already is like the first sign that you've decided, I'm not going to stay in this place, and I'm not going to feel that heaviness anymore. And even that 10-minute appointment with my own GP, I was like, oh, the relief that, I don't think I've got cancer, it does make a huge difference. In your mind, it affects your sleep. Relationships, has a knock-on effect with your work, as you mentioned. So the knock-on effect that we think when we're burying something, it's fine, but actually it's because it manifests in a different way.
That's exactly it. I genuinely thought that I could just carry on with my life, and then and for 3 years I did, like, in a way, but it often these things find their way back up to the surface. And I think that there is light at the end of the tunnel. I don't want people to kind of come away thinking, okay, right, I'm just going to tell someone and then I'm just going to it's all sorted. It's a journey for sure. It's a healing journey, but not being alone during that time makes a big difference.
Yeah. And as humans, we're not meant to survive by ourselves. The reason we are strong is because we did it as a tribe.
Yes. We need other people. We do. We really do.
Definitely. So if there was something that you now, like, this has got you to doing this podcast, I was a coach in hypnotherapy, a therapist. What is it now, the importance of your work going forward as you're sharing this story? Tell me a little bit more about sort of your passion now for people listening to this and what you stand for, because this is bigger than you, bigger than us right now. Story, and you're standing for something. What is it that you're standing for?
I mean, I really feel like my mission now is to share the stories of other women who have felt shame for whatever reason. And I think that going back to how I was inspired by hearing Dr. Christine Blasey Ford speak her truth, I recognize the value, the importance of hearing the stories of others, because it was in that moment, hearing her speak, that I was like, I'm not alone. And I think that just to even give hope and connection to other people by sharing these stories makes a huge difference. I think it will make a huge difference to so many people. I hope it makes a huge difference to so many people. And the work that I do, whether it's one-to-one or podcast or on social media, is really all about kind of empowering women to let go of shame. And I think I've reached a point in my life now where I really do feel like I've rediscovered my self-worth. And I think that was at rock bottom, and I didn't realize that. And it took something like this awful thing that's happened to me for me to kind of realize that I didn't feel worthy. And so that realization and being able to work on that has made a huge difference in my life, and I want other people to be able to experience that as well.
Yeah, thank you. And those days where you don't feel worthy, or those days when you don't feel confident, is there anything that you can share that you do now for yourself to self that I am worthy? You know,
yeah.
We have those times, right, where as we grow and stretch, we just have like this, oh, maybe I can't do it.
Yes.
How do you
Yeah, do you know what? I think what's interesting now is I've realized that the times when I feel fear about doing something are probably the times when I need to lean in and do it even more, because one of the biggest lessons that I've had is that I grow stronger every time I face a fear. And I have real moments of just feeling pride in myself by overcoming things. And I want people to realize that this journey that you may well be starting on is not an easy one necessarily. It's not necessarily going to be straightforward, but you are going to find courage that you didn't realize was there, but has always been there. And I think that has been something that I have found in myself. So yeah, whether you're not feeling confident, whether you don't necessarily accept yourself as you are at the moment, that can change, and you have the power to change that.
Yeah, and I really resonate with that, because everything that I do, you know, even doing this podcast, if you told me even 10 years ago that I'd be doing this podcast or interviewing you on this, I'll be like, oh, no way, I wouldn't be doing that. And here I am doing it. And there is that a little bit of fear, because it's my first one. But what reminds me of like leaning in, as you mentioned, is like, this story is bigger than me. It's not about me, not about you, even. It's actually about who are we doing it for. And if one person can hear your story and can either phone the police or reach out to someone, you know, we've done something. Yeah. And that's important. So thank you.
Thank you.
And on that last final question, as your podcast and everything you're doing is about remarkable women, who would you say is your remarkable woman that has inspired you and has got you here, and why?
Yes. I really would have to go back to Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. I really, if you don't know who this woman is, I would say do look her up. I'll put a link to her story in the show notes. I really believe just hearing those words, hearing her talk about how she felt afraid, but she spoke her truth anyway. I can't underestimate how pivotal that moment was, because even with the whole Me Too movement that was happening prior to that, I hadn't found it in me yet to speak to anyone, but it was hearing those words that inspired me. And so, yeah, I would say that for me, she is my remarkable woman. There's so many. I could be here for a long time. You're one of them as well, Darlene. I have to say.
Thank you. You too. But it's like it's like her light had got you to follow her, and then now you're sharing your light, and hopefully this podcast and the work that you're doing with your client you're sharing your light and you're sharing your story. So I want to say thank you, and thank you for allowing me to and trusting me with interviewing you on your own story.
Thank you for listening to Speak Shame with Dr. Connie Corrali, and thank you so much to Darlene Davies for guest hosting this week's show. Please take a look at the show notes if you need to access any support. If you'd like to join the community, head over to Dr. Connie Corrali on Instagram or Speak Shame on Facebook and Instagram. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast to get weekly episodes. I'll be back next Thursday.